So we're in for a special treat tonight. Brad is joined in conversation by the author of Doubting Thomas, Matthew Clark Davison. My name is Shira. I work for the Booksmith, an independent bookstore and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. So to introduce tonight's stars, we have Matthew Clark Davison's debut novel, Matthew Clark Davison with his debut novel, Doubting Thomas, which was published in summer 2021 by Amble Press, and Booksmith had the great pleasure of hosting the launch. And the star of tonight is Brad Listi, born in Milwaukee, the author of the novel Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. His other books include the novel Attention Deficit Disorder, an LA Times bestseller, and Bored, a work of nonfiction collage co-authored with Justin Benton. He is the founding editor of The Nervous Breakdown, an online literary magazine. And in 2011, he launched the Other People podcast, which features in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. And he lives in Los Angeles. Brad, we're thrilled to be with you tonight. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for taking some time to talk with us. Matthew, thank you so much for leading this conversation, and I'm very happy to turn it over to you two.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Shira and the Booksmith. And Brad, you're going to start by reading some of your wonderful novel.
All right, I'm going to read a short bit from Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. I'm starting on page 143 if you're at home and you want to read along. This book is a work of autofiction, and it's the narrator's named Brad Listi, and it's about, among other things, its own creation. It's about creation of family. It's about the narrator and his wife coming to grips with the disabilities that that their youngest child has. So in the section that I'm going to read, it's about other things too, but in the section that I'm going to read, it revolves around the process of diagnosis for their youngest child, Oscar, and how that went. So here we go. Oscar was about 6 months old when Franny first noticed the fist. How he would clench his little left hand when she picked him up, the arm fixed behind his back, as if he were expecting to be cuffed. There was also the issue of his attention, and how on occasion he would seem to drift off, eyes open, staring out into space, unresponsive to voices or attempts at physical communication. The episodes never lasted long, a few seconds at most, but were noticeable enough to cause some concern. Is he having petit mal seizures? We couldn't help but wonder. Even a cursory glance at the internet could send both of us into quiet frenzies of panic. Franny in particular was fragile around such topics. She had been struggling for months with postpartum depression, just as she had with Alice. With both of our kids, I handled the bulk of the childcare duties in the first year, night duty in particular, as Franny's blues tended to come on most strongly after dark. Doctor's appointments were also dicey. I did most all of those. It was at Oscar's 6-month appointment that I mentioned the fist and the possible seizures to Dr. Weintraub, our pediatrician. I can still see the furrow in her brow as she looked down at him on the examination table, noodling with his arm, playing with his hand a bit, frowning slightly, suggesting that I have it checked by a pediatric neurologist as a precautionary measure. Pulling out her notepad, she scribbled down her chicken scratch referral, and moments later, I was standing on the sidewalk on Wilshire on a breezy and unseasonably warm day in January. Cars whizzing by, a police helicopter buzzing overhead. Outwardly, I was calm, but at chest level, there was an acute sense of dread. I remember looking down at Oscar in his stroller and actually saying aloud to him, very quietly, "I think you're going to be the one that I have to worry about. The 10 days that followed are a period of time that I'm capable of recalling with a sense of nostalgia. The final 10 days of our typical life, when we were all still removed from more harrowing realities. Part of me, I think, deep down, understood even then that we were in for a difficult road. And Franny was aware of it too. We knew. We didn't really speak of it though, each of us holding our fears close to the vest, as if discussing any hard possibilities might somehow cause them to manifest. And apart from that, there was the simple matter of reflexive denial, the wanting to remain unaware. Never underestimate a parent's ability to achieve this feat in a situation of this nature. Even a person like me, who likes to think of himself as sober-minded and open to hard truths, had zero ability at this stage to seriously engage with an idea as heartrending as cerebral palsy. The fact is that it wasn't in my field of possibility. If something was wrong, I told myself, then surely it was fixable. And besides, nothing official had been communicated yet. Everything at this point was precautionary, speculative. We were simply following Weintraub's advice in the interest of ruling things out. To get too wound up about anything beyond that was out of order and premature. Together, Franny and I made a solemn vow that we would refrain from any neurotic Googling, and both of us, against the odds, managed to obey the moratorium for the ensuing 10 days. The pediatric neurologist at Cedars was a tall, reed-thin, bespectacled man named Richard Zabitsky, a brilliant doctor, according to Weintraub, but one with the bedside manner of a large fence post. While giving Oscar a thorough physical examination, he suggested to me, with unnerving neutrality, that my son may have suffered a stroke in utero. But without a clear picture of his brain, he added, it would be impossible to make any kind of true diagnosis. As such, it was his recommendation that Oscar undergo a brain MRI as soon as possible, a procedure that would involve a brief period of anesthesia. I was instructed to call a certain number to coordinate scheduling at the hospital's imaging center. The procedure, Zabitsky assured me, was safe and straightforward and would last about an hour. I thanked him and went home. It was 3 weeks later, after the MRI had been conducted, after I had watched Oscar be anesthetized, his little body laid out flat at the mouth of the machine, that my phone rang at around midday on a sunny Thursday in February. Whenever I think back and try to pinpoint the exact moment when I knew for certain that my life had changed, I tend to return to this call and the receptionist from Cedars on the line, and me in our old house on 4th Street, the worn-out Spanish bungalow with the citrus trees out back. We need to get you in for an appointment, the receptionist said. The doctor would like to go over some results. I asked her what was happening. My heart racing suddenly, a sick feeling. She told me that I needed to come in for the appointment and the doctor would go over everything then. Why don't you tell me right now? I said. She wouldn't tell me. I think you should tell me now, I said. She wouldn't tell me. I lost my shit. I think I can remember, being in my bedroom, standing by the screen door that opened out to the deck. It was always too dark in that room, but the lawn outside was bright. I seem to recall dropping into a crouch, barking into the receiver, demanding that this woman tell me what the fuck was going on with my son. But of course, she wouldn't tell me. Hospital policy. This isn't something we can do over the phone, sir. My face flushed red with anger, a surge of terrible fear in my chest. A tangerine tree outside bearing fruit, possibly a hummingbird. This, I like to tell myself, was when everything suddenly shifted. When the creeping dread that had been plaguing me for weeks finally brought me to the point of overwhelm, just as the diagnostic process reached its miserable crescendo. I have also sometimes told myself over the years that this was the precise moment when my excessively long childhood reached its conclusion. The brief, hard flash in time when at long last I finished growing up and instead just started aging. So there's a happy little story. But that's a bit of the book, from the heart of the book.
Thank you, Brad. Congratulations.
Thank you. And by the way, everybody should read Doubting Thomas, Matthew's excellent novel. I had the pleasure of talking with him about it on my podcast, and that is how we met, and it is a superb novel. So
Well,
a plug for Doubting Thomas.
thank you. Well, I'm curious. What I was interesting because that place that you decided to read from was one of the places that I had picked. And I just have to say a couple of quick things to our audience before I ask you my first question. And one is that in works of autofiction, and even when I teach creative writing in a MFA program, and even when doing nonfiction, we always refer to the character as the character or the narrator. And then and your character's name is Brad, but so is yours. So I'll say you when I mean Brad Listi, the author, and I'll say Brad when I mean Brad Listi, the character in the novel.
Fair enough.
You know, one of the things that makes me really happy about having read this book is that you're such an incredible literary citizen. You've done so much to amplify the works of other people. And, you know, just everyone, like I just couldn't. Well, I think I first listened to other people for a George Saunders interview, and then you also have people like me on there, and everybody in between as far as name recognition. And so it was just thrilling to be able to read your creative work after hearing you amplify the works of so many other people. And I did choose that very, very, very same passage to ask you to read, and the reason was because I was curious if that was the scene that anchored the narrative of the whole novel, like would you, like if it was the scene that made you know, okay, this is a novel. And you know, I love it the way that it's portrayed with that sort of calm at the beginning and the not Googling, and we sort of know that there's 10 days there, and then there's like the helicopter buzzing, and it's the warm day, and then the tangerine outside falling from the fruit tree, but then bam, we get the news. And I wondered if that were the scene that anchored it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the pivot, right? It's the moment at which the protagonist's life irrevocably changes. And for me as a writer, it's a difficult scene to write because it's born of lived experience. And, you know, it's one of those things where I realized that I had to do it. I just forgot to plug in my mic here, of course, but so if my voice changes and gets more clear, that's why. But it's one of those things that I had to confront. And I think once I got it on the page, it made the back half of the book come together more easily. So yeah, it's sort of like the fulcrum. I think it's the fulcrum. And, you know, the first half of the book has to do with creativity and creative exasperation in an artistic sense, I think primarily. And then the back half of the book focuses on creativity, or, you know, creative exasperation in the theme of creation from the perspective of family. And that's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it gets to the gist of it.
What I also love about that scene is that that Brad, the narrator, is also realizing that um, he had a framework that he thought these are the things that are within the realm of possibility, and then he becomes a person that realizes that that framework may not have, that something in his own life is going to be different from what um, was up until that point in that frame of possibility. And I think the wonderful fiction and storytelling kind of starts there with the thing that the character never imagined could possibly happen to them.
I mean, you're talking about the diagnosis.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the way that you portrayed it too. Yes.
It's, I think I speak again from lived experience. It's always the last thing as a parent that you like, even when you might suspect, or even when there are signs pointing towards a difficult diagnosis. Like I say, parents have an unbelievable ability to deny those possibilities up until it becomes undeniable. And so, that was the case. I think hopefully I rendered it in a way that's true to life and would be recognizable to other parents who have gone through similar things. Obviously, no two situations are exactly alike, but medical diagnoses, especially difficult ones, are always tricky terrain. And then when they involve children, especially so, I think anything happening to one's kids is always kind of the worst case scenario that parents will, try not to entertain. But then when you're confronted with it, it's tough. And it's hard to language. It's hard to language those moments. And so it presented particular difficulties as a writer, to try to get it down accurately. And then it was just uncomfortable to revisit. That kind of stuff is not pleasant to write, but it was necessary for the story.
Yes, I am not a parent myself, but I did relate to it in just thinking about so many different things. I mean, I am an uncle, and I have had firsthand experience. My best friend's daughter had a cancer diagnosis when she and had to go through treatments for it for 4 years, and starting with open. Like with brain surgery. And it's just, you enter into a realm that is so far beyond what it is that you're able to imagine. And then also, just bargaining around, like, oh, this doctor said this that was slightly hopeful. And so I do feel like you portrayed those it felt like that you portrayed them so beautifully, to the fact that it made me kind of grateful in a way. It's hard enough with people that you love of any kind. But Brad, I also wanted to talk about, and was hoping that you would read just the Merton quote and the Simek quote right at the beginning, because I think it's such an excellent frame for what follows.
So the epigraphs, the little quotes at the beginning of the book, there's 2 of them. The first is from Thomas Merton, who was, I believe, a Trappist monk, like a Catholic monk, but one who in the mid-20th century gained some renown, I think, for his opposition to the Vietnam War and the bridges that he built between Eastern religion and Western religion. He was kind of a groovy Catholic monk, if that's a way to put it. And he's also a good writer. He wrote a classic called The 7-Story Mountain. And so one of the epigraphs, the one from Merton, goes like this: "If you write for God, you will reach many men and bring them joy. If you write for men, you may make some money, and you may give someone a little joy, and you may make a noise in the world for a little while. If you write for yourself, you can read what you yourself have written, and after 10 minutes, you will be so disgusted that you will wish that you were dead." I don't know if you want, I'll do the second one just because it's so short, but the second one is just, it's a little tiny poem by Charles Simic, and it's the poem from which the book derives its title. And so the Charles Simic line is this: "Short poem, be brief and tell us everything."
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you to read one more thing.
Okay.
prior to asking you a question about that's sort of tied into that. And that's the small section on 61 to 62.
Okay.
This is you and Penny.
Yep. You should write a funny novel, my friend Penny once told me. We were walking down the street together. I was telling her about my book, some version of it, and how it was driving me completely insane. You're funny, she said. Have some fun with it. Write something funny. I'm trying, I said. But it always comes back to what's heavy. Death and grief and tragedy and all the rest. It's like I can't avoid it. But somehow there has to be jokes. Humor, she said, and I'm paraphrasing, is emotional pain remembered in a state of complete serenity. It's the second part, I said, that's causing me all the problems. Okay, said Penny. Then here's another approach. Instead of being funny, pay careful attention to the things you're most ashamed of and put all of those things in the book.
Thank you. My friend Monique Jenkinson is here, and she shared a quote with me at one point. It was the great theater director M. Bogart, who said, if what you do or make does not embarrass you sufficiently, then it's probably not personal or intimate enough. So I love the quotes that you have at the beginning of the book. The Merton one is hilarious. And also your book is very, very funny. It is filled with these moments of complete humor. But I was wondering if you could talk for a minute about shame as a motivating factor in art or in the book.
Well, I think that in a book like this, which is a confessional narrative and a book written in a state of like creative exasperation, deep creative exasperation, and a state of kind of creative surrender, it made sense to me to go there. I think the project of this book, the way that I framed it to myself as I was writing it, which happened, like the final draft of this was rendered during the pandemic of 2020. So there was a big push to finish it right around the time that lockdown first happened. And it took several months, but I framed it to myself that I would write it as if I were already dead, which I guess in retrospect makes some sense. Like mortality is always in the air. If you're wired a certain way, it's always kind of on your radar. But I think that with the pandemic, it seems logical that it would have been more so. And I think I just had enough. I was like, okay, I need to talk about this stuff. It's bothering me. I can't get out from under it. Every time I sit down at the keyboard, this is what is presenting itself. There's no getting around it. And I didn't want to get around it at a certain point. I think that maybe if I were a different kind of writer, I would have written some grand narrative or spun some kind of like fictional web that was far afield from my own lived experience. And it would have stood in as a kind of simulacrum of my own life or some sort of substitute for my own life and experiences. And I would have gotten to work with similar themes or the same themes and, made some sort of art out of it. But I think for me, it was more like, let's look at this stuff head on and let's be as revelatory and self-exposed as possible, as truthful as you can possibly be, as vulnerable on the page as you can possibly be, as uncomfortable in the writing maybe as you can possibly be. Because I think one of the things that's easy for writers to trick themselves into believing is that you can move quickly through the tough stuff or avoid it altogether. And even if you're somebody who knows better, you can still trick yourself. It's very easy to do. And for me, I was always either skirting around it or moving quickly or being too jokey when it was the wrong time. There are all these little ways that we kind of emotionally avoid. And in this iteration, I just sort of went for it. And that doesn't mean, like, as you said, the book has hopefully some funny moments. I didn't want the book to be like a drag and to leave people just weeping. I like for it to do a little of both because I think life does a little of both. So I think that was sort of the situation that the book was written in. And I think it had to have happened at the end of a long process that was filled with a lot of failure. You know, there was just, like, as the book itself attests, there were so many different iterations and attempts to work away from this stuff. And finally, I just gave up and tried to say what happened and tried to look at it closely and tried to slow down where it hurts in the writing.
I think every human being that I know that lives to a certain age has that thing, or that series of things that sort of goes on to define them for a really long time afterwards, or could or can, that they wrestle with on a regular basis. And for me, for sure, it was AIDS, and losing so many people to that disease. And I just remember when I ended up going to college and then going to get an MFA, which was unlikely. And I remember sitting with my thesis advisor, and she says, "You're writing about AIDS even when you're not writing about AIDS. So you might as well just write about AIDS." And so,
right, I recognize
okay.
that.
Yeah. So I think that's something that, you know, it's true. And I also came to be a writer, not so much because I had always admired writers and because I wanted to be, but because I was so terrified of not getting those stories down of those people. I think at first it shifted, but I related to that, wanting to just tell it. I'm going to ask another question about that in a little while, but I wondered whether or not you'd bring us to that point on page 136 and 137. It's 15 years after the narrator and Franny get married in Positano, which is one of my favorite places on earth, by the way. I can't believe I was lucky enough to go there. And so I was wondering if you could just read that small section, and then I'll ask you a question about it.
136 and 137.
Yeah.
Okay. Here we are, nearly 15 years removed from those big gusts of wind on that patio in Positano. And of course, it went by in a blink. In some ways, we've gotten more than we bargained for. In other ways, we've gotten less. That's life. That's love. All of it is trauma in the end. Marriage is hard and it's divine. It can be so effortless. It can take so much work. In my better moments, I experience it as a kind of practice. Over the years, I found that it's less about a happy, magical union among disparate souls than it is about fracturing. Nobody ever told me this, how marriage breaks you open in 1,000 different places, forcing you to reveal yourself and to confront your own depths, and if you're lucky, to see your own shortcomings for exactly what they are. A kind of holy ordeal, a test of endurance, complete with daily rituals of love and forgiveness. The little things, the golden moments, a hand placed inside of another hand, the kiss before bed, the code words, the apologies, the fucking, and how accumulated grief can have an impact on all of it. The miscarriages, Oscar, Alice having a panic attack about Cesar Chavez dying in his sleep, Franny and I dealing with everything as it comes, trying our best, bearing the sacred weight of our shared wounds, most of the time in silence. The two of us in bed, not even 7 a.m., racing to have sex before the kids wake up. And the grief is there. Something else nobody ever told me. How even the act of fucking becomes freighted with unexpected meanings and associations when you're heartbroken over a child. To have to face one another like that in the wake of it all. Bodies slapping together, faces just inches apart. Doing the very thing that brought you all of this heartbreak in the first place. And yet, there we go, doing it anyway, trying. And sometimes it can all be too much. The emotion can overtake us. The guilt. Things can get stirred up. We'll lie there after the fact feeling agitated rather than properly spent. But other days, on better mornings, when our minds will leave us alone, it functions exactly as it's supposed to, as a temporary reprieve and an act of vengeance against all that has befallen us and will eventually befall us down the line.
Thanks, Brad. I absolutely love that passage. And thank you so much for reading it. Your book is just filled with all of these moments of grief and also some incredibly life-giving, in this case, literally life-giving moments, all mashed up. And I wondered if you could talk about this as either a narrative strategy for maybe the word nerds that are tuning in, or even if as a strategy to psychologically, allow yourself to get it down on the page.
So I'm just to make sure I understand your question. It's like, can you repeat it? Like, I'm trying to make sure I've got it before I answer.
Yeah, this way in which you're mashing up grief with all of these other moments that we don't necessarily readily associate with grief, like fucking, for example.
Right. Well, that's what's interesting about grief, isn't it? I mean, when you're going through it, it's not like some sort of exclusive experience that happens off to the side in its own little box. It's something that can infiltrate your life in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. And I think I was trying to portray that, especially when it's child-related grief. It makes sense that sex would be a place where it would be triggered, or it could be triggered. And that's so strange in a way, it's such a strange experience. And I think that's, when we talk about how the book is funny and the book is also sad and heartfelt and bracing at times, to read about, because the tough stuff is really tough. I try to mash those kinds of things up and blend those kinds of experiences intentionally, because that's how my lived experience functions. Like I always say, you can have, like, some of the greatest laughs I've ever had have been at like funeral receptions, not during a funeral, but sometimes, it can happen. And so that's part of life. We have to seek humor, I think, in times of duress often, at least if you're wired like I am. And you might also be super depressed and witness the most beautiful sunset of your life, or, something awful happens and then something wonderful happens 5 minutes later. Like, how are you supposed to deal with that? And so I wanted this book, and I want all of my books to reflect that absurd circumstance. And I think that's what I'm doing. And I think too, it can ventilate the read for the reader. I think that, there are certain experiences in life or certain scenes that you might write down or portray on the page that, need to be sort of done straight and without any like punchline. I'm not saying that every awful thing has to have a punchline, but I often try to do that because I learned from the error of my ways in previous iterations of this book that, I'm trying to communicate with a reader. I'm not just trying to barf out my trauma onto the page. Like, this is a book. This is a narrative that I want people to be able to read and enjoy and be edified and moved by. And as I've often said, it took me kind of an embarrassingly long time to get attuned to the reader at the other end of this thing. And maybe that's just what the editorial process is for. Maybe I just need more work on that particular aspect of writing, but I needed to get the manuscript to a place where I was really communicating with a reader and thinking about the reader's needs primarily, and making sure that the narrative would work for them, and that it wasn't just like beautifully rendered for my own purposes. I think that might tie back. That's a nice way to call back the Thomas Merton epigraph, where he's talking about if you're writing for yourself, you're going to want to off yourself in like 5 minutes. It just means you're going to end up with an outcome that's probably not satisfying to anybody ultimately. And, when he says, if you write for God, you'll bring joy to many people, like, I don't intend that dogmatically or even religiously. I just think that it's about writing from the deepest place and taking a big swing, before you die. And kind of seeing things through that lens. And when you do that in good faith, then I think usually the writing will connect.
Well, the Thomas Merton quote talks about God, but so does Brad, the character in the book, to his daughter Alice, or tries to. And
Sure.
I love that. I love the definition of God there, because I think that for me, like, a break happened to me. You and I were both raised Catholic, and a big break happened for me when I prayed for something a lot as a kid, and then a bad thing happened instead of the good thing that we were praying for to a good person. And then, of course, as a teenager, when my friends were all getting sick, like you can't show up in the hospital room if you don't think it's going to work out. It's just, you can't be that young and face, changing the diaper of somebody that that's that age, and not think, oh, there's a cure coming down the pike, or there's something good that's going to happen if I endure this. It's sort of a Catholic mindset, in my opinion. And I couldn't believe in anything like God until the concepts that Brad in the book talks to Alice about. If it's, I think it's literally in the poop, right? God is in the poop.
I mean, I'm talking to a kid, in the book, and trying to, I think as parents, you get confronted by your children with these big questions. And, my MO has basically been to be like, I don't know. But then kids will always, they'll double down and say, well, they'll ask another question. And so you feel this sort of pressure to come up with something that is satisfying, but that does not do any damage, that has some wisdom in it, but is a gentle wisdom. For me, it's about being non-dogmatic, not professing any certainty that I don't truly have. But I also don't want to leave my kid feeling like nihilistic or like terrified of this. Like, I don't have like the Werner Herzog universal view of like it's a cold and terrible place, like of death and destruction, like that's not what I want to hand to my child. And that's not honestly what I believe. Like, I'm not a total materialist, and I just have some room in my universal view for like some magic. And I think too, it maybe is rooted in a sense of wonder and just not knowing. Like, we know so little, and all you got to do is like look up at outer space and ponder it in a serious way for like 5 minutes, and it becomes pretty mind-blowing. So it's trying to kind of boil all that down into some language that a 6-year-old can understand, and that's not easy. And if you have like a rambling tendency like I do, then it gets really fraught because you can easily screw it up, like being concise is your friend, I think, in these conversations, but it can be very easy to like spend 10 minutes jabbering at a 6-year-old. And then at the end of it, they just go like, what? Or they're crying, or, whatever. So.
But as a person who's more than 6, I can tell you that I needed to hear what Brad had to say to Alice in the book about God.
I'm glad to hear that. I think I think that's the thing, is that we have these kind of binary approaches to matter spiritual too often, where it's like, I'm a believer, I'm an atheist, or I believe, all this kind of stuff. And I just think that uncertainty is kind of the guiding principle, but engagement with this stuff is healthy and interesting. And part of the project, I would imagine, of being alive, like we have to kind of come to some understanding of why we're here and build some sort of meaning and try our best to understand what's going on, like with some humility. I don't think any of us is probably going to crack the code of the universe in our lifetimes, though maybe somebody will. But possibly, or probably more important than that, and certainly more important than that to me, is the issue of how to deal with human suffering. That's the real issue. Like, I'm not as interested in the mysticism or the trying to sort out the cosmos in my 85-year lifespan or whatever it will be. But I am interested, and I think you can make some real headway in trying to like understand human suffering and how to address it. And so, it's that, and then it's just the silliness of parenthood and being presented with kid questions and having to respond.
Yes. Something's coming to mind about a kid I know that asked my brother, but I'm going to save that just because I'm looking at the time, and I'll tell you some other time about that one. But okay. I would like to encourage the people that came to listen to Brad tonight to please put some questions in the chat. I do have a couple of little on the very bottom of page 159, starting with the word Zapruder. Matthew Zapruder and I were once both in the same literary magazine, and we were doing a reading, and I was sitting in the chair marked Matthew, and he said, "I think that chair is for me." And I said, and I pointed to the next one that also had a Matthew on it. That's my memory. But the Brad in the book, like Brad in real life, is a person that has a literary podcast. Matthew Zapruder is a poet who wrote a book about his experiences with parenthood. And on the bottom of page 159, and just that little next couple of paragraphs, if you could read, then I'll ask you a question.
So wait, are you talking about 158, the section from his book? Like, where does it begin?
No, just the very bottom of page 159. Zapruder, listening carefully. Just a tiny little snippet.
Zapruder, listening carefully, remained silent for a beat, then shared a story about fellow poet Robert Haas, explaining how Haas, whenever he got stuck on a poem, would often address the issue by putting the problem in the poem. Which is to say, Zapruder said, if you're struggling with something, uncomfortable in some way, then maybe the best approach is simply to talk about that in the book. Chekhov said as much too. Address it directly, aware of the fact that it's not about solving anything on the page. Just to state the problem clearly on its own can be enough.
And I want to rewind back to something that you said about humor, and it's not like just as like something hard, then it's a joke. But I do think that if people, I tell undergrads a lot who tend to be in that moment of kind of like the world sucks and it's not what I thought it was going to be. And, you know, there's a lot of cynicism in undergrad early draft stories. And I'm just, you know, if you can pull off cynicism and sarcasm in a story, you're doing a great job, because it's one of the hardest things to do. And then also talking around things, as you alluded to earlier. There is something about both you as a person and the character Brad in the book that seems to be mystified by language and its power. But also in this passage, I think we're also talking about the failure of language, which comes up in the book again and again. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. It seems like a tiny bit of a contradiction in the power that language seems to have in you as both a reader and as a person that wants to express yourself in writing, but also that it always fails.
Yeah, it has its limits, you know, and I think that sometimes it can be easy for people who are entrusted or who have declared themselves writers and are trying to write books and communicate with readers. It can be easy for such people to trick themselves into thinking that they have to have the answer in order for the work to be effective. And that, I would argue, is a misapprehension of the job. You know, it's not about having complete mastery or having like a beautifully like wrapped answer with a bow on top. But I think that, you know, to state the problem can be enough, just as Zapruder says. You know, if you have a quandary or a difficult challenge that you're wrestling with philosophically or emotionally or psychologically, and you're trying to render it in a book of some kind, you know, it can be easy to believe or to fool yourself into thinking that you have to have it completely summed up in order for the book to work. And that's not the case. And I think that, you know, when it comes to the kinds of particular existential challenges that the Brad in the book is facing, you know, in particular with the diagnoses that are affecting his son, you know, you get hit with stuff like that. And if you haven't ever experienced the failure of language in a serious way, like that'll do it, you know, like what are you supposed to say? At a certain point, you exhaust yourself. I mean, you'll try, like you said, to look for, you know, you'll try to look for silver linings. You'll try to convince yourself that medical technology, I mean, this is done in the book, you know, where you're talking about like nanotechnology and it's going to be fine and I'm going to keep praying and all this kind of stuff. But then at a certain point, you sort of punch yourself out and you're just left in a place that's kind of quiet and there is no language. And that, I think, is where you need to get to, or one of the places you need to get to along the way to acceptance. And acceptance isn't exactly a pleasant thing. You know, I think it's often portrayed in a kind of Pollyanna-ish way in the culture when it comes to like grief or some sort of like rupture in our lives, that really destabilizes us. And it's like, well, you just got to finally get to a place of acceptance. Acceptance is a bitter pill. It's not necessarily like I accept and you're like happy and cheerful. It's like more like you're quiet and alone and exhausted. And you're finally like, I can't change this. I can keep fighting it or I can just accept it. And I don't want to accept it because it's fucking awful. But I seem to have no choice. And if I keep fighting it, I'm going to drive myself crazy and probably make things worse. And so, I don't know. That's one of those hard realities of a thing like this. And we all go through them, and it seems to be a hard one, wisdom, because it's a very human thing, I think, to want to resist. It's a very human thing, I think, to want to deny or fight back or beat it somehow. And sometimes you just can't, and that's difficult.
Yeah, there's a kind of like subtext happening throughout the text about our culture, Los Angeles, consumerism, the distinction between our private inner lives and our performed lives in a cafe. And I don't want to ask you to read it, partially because we have some questions and partially because I think it's such a beautiful, beautiful scene to just come upon for the reader. But I just want to tell you that a moment that punctured, where I was able to simultaneously hold all of the grief that the characters were going through, and the love that they had for one another, the bonds that they had created with one another, was when they were going around the track and Oscar and that little boy said what he said and did what he did. And I don't want to say anything else. I want everybody to go out and buy the book if they haven't already and find it. It was so beautiful.
Yeah, that was a great that's a great moment, I think, too. Child wisdom. It's a moment of child wisdom where, you're an adult and you're fumbling and you're denying and you're anguished and you're dealing with all this heartbreak. And then like an 8-year-old comes up to you and says exactly the right thing.
It's so good. Everybody needs to find that in the book. Okay, so Aaron is asking, small detail, what's your process for coming up with character names, given that they're based largely on real people in your life?
It's really not something that I spent a ton of time on in this book. I've had conversations about this, in particular with people in my life, where they're like, wait a minute, why did you pick this name? And in some cases, it's like there's a family connection. In other cases, it was just like I used my godson's name, and I think like they were placeholders when I was drafting, and then they just never changed. So I tried to protect the innocent or change names where I felt it was appropriate. If somebody was no longer with us and I felt like it was a pretty benign reference or something, or, I was less inclined to change, but I put my own, I didn't change my own name for a reason. I want to signal kind of overtly to the reader that this is a confessional narrative and I'm not hiding much and I'm trying to drop the mask. But I also did change things, and I did leave some things out or twist things around or amalgamate certain characters or shuffle some things timeline wise or just completely make stuff up. Like that did happen. And the reason that it happened is that I couldn't write the book for a reader any other way. And I didn't have a good enough memory or any diaries to reference really to build it. It's just what I landed on. So I needed a little bit of creative license, but I also very much wanted it to be a book that, that people know that it's just me, and I don't make any bones about that. So yeah, I didn't spend that much time on character names. Maybe I should have spent more.
Vaughn asks, did you find that writing the book was cathartic and gave you some comfort, or did it dredge up old uncomfortable feelings and represent a digression of your healing?
Oh no, I think it's the former. I think that the way through is through, right? It's like what's the corny old saying? It's like no feeling, no healing, right? So I think again, I think reflexively human beings, when they're confronted with really difficult things, will do almost anything to avoid like a real serious reckoning with those uncomfortable things and those deep, painful feelings, because it's deep and painful. But in the absence of any kind of real reckoning with it, it'll only fester and get worse, or it'll continue to pester you. So I think I was solid enough in the understanding of that, I eventually got there. Trust me, I tried other avenues, which the book itself describes. I tried to write versions of this book that were very far afield and would sort of distract me, but found that they ultimately weren't successful or satisfying. And yes, like I think that, you write books, or some people write books to try to get rid of stuff that's no longer maybe serving them, or things we need to kind of get rid of. And that's the case with this. It's not that it's solved every last thing, but by looking at it closely and by writing it down and kind of forcing myself to slow down where it hurts and to sit still with it for a long time and to render it in language. Yeah, I mean, I think it's therapeutic. I think it gave me some reprieve and some deeper understanding of it. It's not that I don't have stuff to learn still. It's not that it still doesn't bother me some days, worse than it does others. But, I don't go to therapy. Apparently I write novels and take mushrooms, but, whatever works for you, I guess.
Um, the what was I going to say? You telling me about mushrooms conjured the image of Oprah, which is another thing that I'll let people. Oprah appears in both of our novels, and I will let people find her in both of our novels.
Yeah,
and so does a lot of bread, carbs as a way of dealing with complex emotions. Brad is stuffing his face with hummus and pita and eating a full basket of bread on a regular basis. Ali asks, do you feel a need to present any boundaries with what you did and didn't share and be brief and tell them everything?
Yeah, I think especially when I'm speaking about, characters who are representative or are in some way tied to people in my lived life. But the truth is that I tried to be as vulnerable and truthful as possible. And I think the reality of this book is that nobody is on the hook more than I am. I think that if anyone's getting dissected in this book, it's me. And that's as it should be. And that's as intended, And so if I'm discussing a character who has some relation to somebody in my actual lived experience, usually the portrayal is really not about them as much as it is about my relationship to them or my experience vis-a-vis their situation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not that the book is self-centered. It's just that I didn't want to take those kinds of liberties. That's their book to write. But the reality is that my lived experience intersects with the lived experiences of other people. And so it's impossible to sort of tell the truth without implicating other people along the way. And it feels a little strange, but I didn't know how to do the book otherwise and to tell this story otherwise. And I just tried to do my best to be truthful. And hopefully, I like to believe that the things that I've rendered aren't in any way, there's nothing intended to hurt anybody. It might be dealing with something that was painful, but I'm not actively trying to expose somebody in a hurtful way. I'm just trying to get to the truth of my experience. And so you do the best you can, to walk that line as a writer. And in this kind of book in particular, that's very confessional. It's just, there's going to be places where it gets a little bit difficult, but so far, everybody in my life has been very patient with me.
Monique pointed out that Oprah loves Brad. So, wow, the three of us are really collecting.
Wait, Oprah loves Brad, or she loves Brad?
I hope that she loves both. But Monique also asked a question. Do you have specific practices for maintaining a sense of humor? Is this important to you in your everyday life as an art? Is it as important in your everyday life as it is in your art?
Yeah, no doubt. I think I've thought about this a lot. Like, I think I have basically the sense of humor of like a 12-year-old boy, which is to say that it's like really wide open. I have a very permissive sense of humor, and I have a kind of holy reverence for comedy and for attempts to make jokes and find humor in life. As long as you're punching up, like I think like that's kind of the litmus. But I give a wide berth to people who are trying to make people laugh, and trying to make a joke. And it's a coping strategy. And I think maybe intake has something to do with it. trying to kind of seek out funny stuff or funny people and befriend funny people, and, you know, have friendships where the shorthand is kind of jokey to begin with, and you're sort of trying to make one another laugh. Some of it, I think, is just biological. It's the way that I'm wired. Some of it, I think, has something to do with um, being a depressive, which I don't know to what extent I'm a depressive, but I think there's something related there where people who are funny are reacting to the darkness. And for goodness sake, I mean, look at the world that we're living in. How can we not all be a little bit depressive? I think it's a pretty, you know, it's a pretty natural response to reality at this point, if it wasn't always. So in terms of maintaining it, I mean, you know, good friends, those kinds of conversations, an awareness that everything is impermanent, nothing lasts, whether it's good or bad. We don't have any idea what's going on. There's an absurdity to our situation that's inherent. Like, we don't even really know where we are. We're in like outer space in this giant, airless, infinite vacuum with all these giant celestial bodies, like a billion. I mean, it's completely crazy to me. We have no idea. We think we know where we are, but we really don't. And I think that if I can keep my lens sort of focused in that way, it's easier for me to find levity. And when I start to see things in too micro, you know, if I get too small in my field of vision, then I can start to take myself and life itself too seriously. So it's an imperfect science, but that's kind of my approach. And then just trying to make sure that I don't want to ever have a narrow sense of humor and start making rules about what's funny. Like, for me, it's like, for God's sakes, like, let's find every funny we can find. We need them all.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the context in which one joke works, taken out of that context, can seem horrifying to some people, but you know, of course, if, like, I don't know, there's so many examples that come to mind where people would probably be mortified about what I laugh at on a regular basis, but you don't know me. You don't know what I've survived.
Listen, I've had conversations with friends of mine where friends of mine have made jokes at the expense of disabled people. They've used a word, they'll use the word retarded. They'll make a joke about the short bus. They don't even realize they're saying it. And I wince a little internally, and I might say, like, after the fact, like, hey, I'm not mad, but just like punch up. Like, I might say that if it feels right. But most of the time, I try to consider context, you know, and I don't know, like, I don't want to deny the fact that I don't like the R word. I never really did, but especially now, you know, I realize, like, oh, that's not a word to use, you know. And at the same time, I think, like, you know, maybe I don't want to come down on people who are not trying actively to be hurtful, but might be doing so accidentally. I think there's a difference. And so, you know, it's a little bit complicated, but it's something that I've noticed. And if somebody's in the act of trying to make light and have a laugh and doesn't have like a bad intent at all, I'm very quick to forgive that. Much quicker than I am to forgive if somebody's actively trying to pick on the little guy or be like mean about it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there's just a difference. It feels complicated to me more than it feels like a black and white moral issue is the thing.
Every single situation is its own unique thing. But I do know exactly what you mean. I think I told you the story about when I was asked by a coworker if which one out of me and my husband was the woman and which one was the man. And everyone else who was not gay in that office was offended on my behalf. And I thought it was great that she, from the context of that particular person and asking that particular question at that particular time, it was funny. And I said to her, I go, well, we don't really think of it that way. How about you and your husband? Which one wears the pants? And we bonded, you know, it was nice. Yeah. So it just depends. It always depends. And you and I definitely are not the people that are going to solve that right now. But I did want to say that you're also hilarious by text. And I think that people probably that have a relationship with you to whatever extent I do, I see you as a very funny person, and also probably listening to you. It's weird talking to you though in real life, because I've listened to you on almost double speed when it's the podcast.
So I seem like I'm on Quaaludes right now to you.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I was going to say that I can tell that you're very, very funny, but like maybe we go to writing for something other than that, because people also are like, gosh, your novel's so serious. And it's like, well, I don't think it is, but I mean, I guess I can see how if somebody thinks that I'm the organ grinder's monkey at the party or whatever, then they might think that the fiction that we write is a little bit more serious. But that's what makes you a dynamic person, and that's what's
I contain multitudes.
You totes contain multitudes, dude. All right. Well, I think that there is somebody that asked, where did it go? Could you see yourself writing the next iteration of the story? That's Lauren.
Yes, I think so, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm working on a book that's about the last 100 days of the Trump regime, from the Tuesday after Labor Day until Inauguration Day. And I don't know exactly how the book is going to play out. I'm in relatively early stages, but I'm imagining that it might be, a kind of collage-y, diaristic remembering in a play-by-play kind of way of what those days were like, because they were completely insane. And I did it for that particular stretch of time. I kept an extremely meticulous diary, not only of my lived experience day to day and just the details of my domestic life, but I also kept a meticulous diary of the news cycle. I recorded every news story as it broke, and I recorded all the tweets that I liked on a daily basis. So I was spending hours a day logging all that stuff, and I've spent the last year and change unpacking it. And I have to get to the writing hopefully soon. I'm on January 10th almost. So I have like 11 days left to unpack, and it can take me like 2 weeks to unpack a single day. There's so much to unpack, especially at the end here with the January 6th and, just the way that things unfolded. But I can tell you that it's even crazier the second time around, rereading it. Like I lived through it once, but then to kind of take it out and take it apart piece by piece and to reread it has been eye-opening, and it's probably aged me like 5 years. It was a very uniquely insane period in American history, and I'm interested in the collision between that and just like the routine domestic day-to-day of our lived experience in the pandemic, which was another element of it. Like that on its own would have been crazy, but all of it together was just quite a lot. And so I think you could fairly characterize it as the next iteration of the story, because it might involve some of the same people and my little domestic bubble, but it's also going to be, I think, a political book and a historical book. And I think the impulse, like I'm searching for urgency, because that served me well in this book, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. I think I realized that I have to have a sense of emotional urgency, like a real sense of emotional and spiritual, even if that's a way of putting it, urgency, in order to sustain the energy necessary to write a book. That's just me. And so when I finished this and it turned out to my satisfaction, I was like, well, where else do I feel a sense of urgency? And I definitely feel a sense of urgency when it comes to fixing in a work of literature the events of those 100 days, and to fix in a work of literature what I see as like the complete insanities and gross injustices of those 100 days. Because I think that in the absence of those kinds of efforts, we can forget, because there's so much coming at us all the time, often by design. And I also know that there are active attempts underway to whitewash all that stuff and to we're seeing books being burned. We're seeing, efforts being made to decide, what elements of our history are taught to our kids and what elements are not. And there's all these different debates happening. And these are attempts at erasure, almost always. It's like we want to erase certain aspects of our history that don't serve our needs or our ideologies. And or might just make us uncomfortable. And I think we need to actively remember so that we can hopefully try to prevent such things from happening again. So that's what I'm up to. I don't know what the end result will be like, but so far I've been able to sustain my energy for more than a year, which is a good sign.
Well, Brad, I'm wishing you all the luck with that project. I didn't turn on the news today until late in the afternoon. I was logged onto a board meeting and somebody had, mentioned it, and I hadn't. I'm behind schedule. And so I was blocking out the world purposely, but part of what I was doing today was reading reading James Baldwin's interview with Studs Terkel after he had written a book about the person that was convicted for all of those murders in Atlanta, all of those children. And it was just so, I kept on thinking this is so contemporary. And then to weirdly turn on the news when my colleague on the board mentioned that was eerie, but I'm so grateful for that connection. So I hope that, because I could never, ever in a million years do what you're doing, I was too spun out to get that down. So please, I'm rooting for you.
I appreciate it. And I thank everybody, everybody at Booksmith for putting this on. Matthew, thank you so much for being so, gracious and able as the host. Thanks to everybody for showing up. I know this has been a bummer of a day with the school shooting in Uvalde and all the shootings that we've had lately. Like, we are living in insane times, and we are ruled too often by insane people, and that needs to end. So hopefully this has been a little bit of a respite, a little bit of a human respite from the darkness of the news cycle. And I just appreciate everybody being there or being here, and for buying the book and reading the book or just showing support. So really appreciate it.
Awesome. Just to wrap up, thank you again, everyone, for coming. Brad Listi, rookie mistake. Thank you so much, and congrats again on the new book. Matthew, also thank you so much for being in conversation and leading this discussion today. For everyone, if you saw, I also pasted another link in the chat to pick up Brad's book if you haven't already. And there's also a link below the video. And we hope to see you at some of our upcoming events. Take care and have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.